I was trimming roses when my son Taryn finally knocked on my door. After 20 years of silence, he didn't ask how I was. He handed me a will and said, "Sign it. It's just a formality. We've already divided everything." I smiled, even as my hands trembled. I raised that boy, fed him, sacrificed for him, and now I was just an obstacle. But what he didn't know was, I'd already changed the will 2 weeks ago, and his daughter? She helped me do it. Tomorrow, when he walks into court, he'll learn the inheritance skipped him completely. Stick with me till the end, and drop your city below if you're watching. This story might just feel too real. The birds were already gathered on the feeder outside my kitchen window. I tapped the glass softly, not to scare them, just to remind myself that something out there was still moving. A pot of black coffee sat untouched. Steam had long stopped rising, like everything else in this house. Morning had become routine, not out of comfort but necessity. You wake up, you feed the birds, you check the mail, you sit, and every day, the phone stares back at you from the table, like it's got a secret it won't tell. Today, though, the waiting felt heavier. Not louder, just heavier. 70 isn't a number you want to toast alone, but I hadn't told anyone. It's not like anyone would have cared to remember. 20 years since the last time Taryn picked up the phone and remembered who I was. Not even a card in that time. Just one ghost of a voicemail 3 years ago. Probably pocket-dialed while he was driving somewhere far from Vermont. Still, I kept it. Played it more times than I'd admit. Just static and a mumble. "Dad?" Maybe. Or maybe it was just my brain trying to stitch hope onto nothing. This morning, I almost deleted it. My finger hovered over the button. Instead, I set the phone down and stared out at the gray sky. That seemed safer. Then came the knock. "Brought you something, Alder?" Marla's voice called through the door. I opened it to find her standing there with a pie in both hands and a half smile on her face. "It's store-bought," she admitted, "but it's got your name on it." I stepped aside to let her in, and we sat at the kitchen table like we always did. 5 minutes of neighborly ritual that said, "I see you, even if your own don't." She talked about her daughter coming up for the weekend, her son bringing his twins. I nodded in the right places, laughed where expected, but the mention of family visiting was a jab in the ribs I didn't bother to block. "You all right?" she asked at one point. "Just thinking about Thanksgiving." I lied. "Probably just going to keep it simple." She nodded, but something in her eyes said she knew. When she left, I stood at the window watching her walk back across the street, pie tin now empty, my stomach full but heart thinner. Later, I found myself sitting in the den, staring at the photograph on the wall. Me, Taryn, and his mother before the divorce. Before he'd begun calling me a control freak. That Thanksgiving, God, it had been ugly. I'd offered him co-ownership of the house, a way to keep the family legacy going. Instead, he'd stormed out saying I was suffocating him, treating him like a child. I hadn't said much, thought my silence would cool things down. I thought silence was strength. Now I wasn't so sure. That evening, I set out a plate for one. Steak and potatoes, jazz playing low in the background. A candle flickered. I didn't need cake, just wanted the moment to mean something. I raised a glass of cheap scotch to the air and said softly, "To the years that taught me how to wait." There was peace in the solitude, not joy, but something close to dignity, until the phone buzzed. Unknown number. One ring, then gone. I stared at the screen, my hand trembling just a little. No voicemail, maybe a telemarketer. Or maybe I didn't call back. I sat still, let the moment settle around me. "If it was you," I whispered, "you'll try again. If not, so be it." I picked up the phone, scrolled to that old voicemail, and pressed delete. For the first time in years. Just as I leaned over to turn off the lamp, the screen lit up again. The soft light of morning crept through the curtains, brushing the floor with pale amber. I hadn't really slept, just drifted in and out of restless thinking, half remembering, half regretting. My bones ached in the way they do when the body remembers more than the mind wants it to. And then I saw it. There, at the foot of the front door, was a pale envelope. Unmarked. No stamp. No return address. Just my name, in blue ink, slanted slightly right. Written with the kind of pressure that leaves faint grooves in the paper. It hadn't been mailed. It had been placed. Curiosity didn't quite rise. It crept, slow and cautious. Whoever left this knew I'd find it first thing, and they wanted me to. I picked it up with care, like it might burn me. The moment I saw the handwriting, my breath paused, older, sloppier than it used to be, but undeniably his, Taryn. I traced the letters with a fingertip, heart tight in my chest like a knotted rope. He hadn't called in 20 years, not a birthday, not a funeral, and now, he was sending letters like a ghost, slipping notes through the veil. Why now? And more than that, why like this? I sat at the kitchen table, the same place I used to read his school report cards, the same spot his mother once baked cinnamon rolls on cold Saturdays. The envelope sat untouched in front of me for what felt like hours. My coffee went cold. I opened it. There weren't pleasantries. No "Dear Dad," no apology, no warmth. Just the cold, straight blade of resentment. He accused me of emotional tyranny, of controlling the narrative of sacrifice. His words were sharp, calculated, too well rehearsed, like they'd been written a dozen times, perfected, pruned of emotion until only venom remained. You called it love. It was a leash. And then the final line, transfer the house to me. Now, before it's too late. No request, a command, from a son who hadn't seen me in 2 decades. A deep cold settled over me. Not anger, not even grief. Something else, a numbness that felt like betrayal turning into fact. My mind flung backward. Years ago, I'd offered shared ownership of the house when Taryn had gotten his first promotion. I thought it was a gesture, a sign that the family legacy could continue, that he could put down roots. He'd looked me in the eye and said, I don't want to be chained to this place, or to you. Then he left. No argument, just that look, equal parts defiance and disdain. I hadn't brought it up again. And sometimes silence felt like the only peace left to offer. Now that silence had curdled into paperwork. I flipped the letter over. My hands were trembling, age or emotion. I couldn't tell. And that's when I saw it. In the bottom right corner, scribbled hastily in a different ink, smaller handwriting, were 8 words that pulled the air from my lungs. I didn't want him to send this. I'm sorry, Grandpa. Lyora. It was her hand, softer, looped letters like her mother's. That tiny sentence carried more weight than all of Taryn's accusations. It cracked something in me, something I'd braced for too long. Not all bridges were burned. One still stood, shaky as it might be. I held the letter up to the light. There were impressions behind the writing. Something had been written over it, maybe on another page pressed against it. Whoever had written it had pressed hard. I reached for a pencil, shaded lightly across the back. At first, nothing. Then, slowly, words emerged, like shadows rising from fog. He's not acting alone. I stared at the phrase until the graphite smudged under my thumb. Not alone. Who else was involved? A cold draft swept under the door again, brushing against my slippers. It didn't feel like weather. It felt like warning. I folded the letter and set it on the table. My gaze drifted to the window where bare trees clawed against the sky. The wind outside had picked up. Leaves swirled in brittle circles on the porch. This isn't just his voice anymore, I said aloud. The house didn't answer, but something told me the next move wouldn't come by letter. The snow had thickened into a steady hush, blanketing everything with that old, forgiving quiet. I was outside, splitting logs near the shed, not because I needed the firewood right away, but because I needed the rhythm, the swing of the axe, the cracking of oak, the feel of something breaking in half. It helped me breathe. That letter hadn't left my pocket all day. Folded once, edges softened by my constant reaching. Every few hours I'd fish it out. Stare again at Leora's tiny apology, and that pencil-shaded line beneath. He's not acting alone, each time. It hit harder, but I wasn't ready for what came next. I paused between swings, hand resting on the axe handle, The snow muffled most sounds, but a flicker of motion near the porch caught my eye. I walked around the house, careful, curious, and stopped cold. There were footprints in the fresh snow. Not mine. They were too close together, too deliberate. They started at the porch steps, led toward the front door. I looked around. No car on the road, no tire tracks, just white everywhere. And those dark, clean shapes pressed into it. I followed them slowly. No wind, no animal sounds, just the soft crunch of my boots following someone else's shadow. He stood waiting for me at the top of the steps. A man, maybe mid-50s, dressed neat but plain, no hat, eyes sharp but polite, too polite. "Mr. Huxley?" he said like it wasn't really a question. I didn't answer. I stood with the axe still in hand, though I didn't lift it. He didn't flinch. "I'm a friend of your son's," he said, stepping down one stair. I thought it was time someone stopped by, face to face. Still no name, just a gloved hand reaching into his coat to hand me a folded slip of paper. He may reach out soon, with terms. I didn't open it yet. My eyes were locked on his face. What kind of terms? He gave a slow, rehearsed smile. Mutual understanding. It's easier when folks don't let pride get in the way. I finally spoke. "You came all this way to say that?" He tilted his head, like someone surveying land that might be for sale. "We'd all prefer peace. You wouldn't want more letters showing up, would you?" That did it. "Leave." I didn't raise my voice. Didn't need to. He nodded once, then stepped down. As he walked across the snow, the porch boards behind him creaked just once. That was when I saw Marla. She was standing near the edge of her yard, holding a bag of birdseed, frozen in place. Her eyes followed him until he was halfway to the road, then flicked toward me. "Everything all right?" she called. "Just a solicitor." I lied. She nodded, still watching the man disappear into the pale blur of snow. I waited until the door was shut, bolted, and the kettle whistling before I unfolded the paper. It wasn't a letter, just an address, handwritten in block letters, Burlington, and two initials, BR. It nearly slipped from my fingers. Beaumont Relis. The name struck like ice in the chest. I hadn't spoken it aloud in 20 years. I sat down, tracing the letters with my thumb. This wasn't just about Taryn anymore. Beaumont had always been clever, calculating, but I never thought he'd resurface like this. Not through back doors and strangers. They weren't playing fair, but neither was I. Not anymore. I stood, tucked the note inside the drawer where I used to keep matches and maps. Snow tapped lightly against the window pane now, as if asking for entry. "They're circling the wagons," I muttered to no one in particular, then added, almost with a smile, "But I've built fire before." The truck engine ticked softly as it cooled beneath the gray morning sky. I'd parked across the street from the building, just far enough to watch unnoticed. The sign above the glass doors read, Northwind Holdings. Same name that had been scrawled on the paper the man left me. I sat for a while, fingers curled around the steering wheel, my breath fogging the windshield. It was the same block Beaumont and I had walked back in '98. We'd been younger then, him with his real estate schemes and me with a toolbox in my truck bed. He'd said the world was built by men who knew how to file paperwork before they broke ground. I'd nodded, not understanding how sharp those words would feel years later. Eventually, I stepped out, boots crunching into the frost-bitten gravel as I crossed to the building. The receptionist looked no older than Lyora, polite, polished, not the type to know how deep the roots of old betrayals ran. "I'm looking for records related to this address," I said, placing the folded paper on her counter. "It has my name on it." She tapped a few keys, then paused. "Yes, Mr. Huxley. You're listed as a co-signer on the original trust. This property's lease was renewed just last month." My lips parted, but no sound came. "That can't be right," I said finally. "I never renewed anything." She tilted her head. "Well, your name's here. Signed electronically." I felt the air in my chest thicken. There hadn't been an email, no phone call, no explanation. Yet my name, my full name, was being used as if I'd signed off on all of it. My signature had lived a life without me. I didn't have to wait long for Devon Frayne. He emerged from a side corridor, all smiles and smooth talk. "Well, this is a surprise," he said, as if we were old college buddies bumping into each other at a coffee shop. He wore the same navy coat from court hearings a decade ago, the same faintly amused tone when he explained things I supposedly misunderstood. "Northwind's one of the holdings we assist with now and then," he said casually. "It's possible something from years back got reactivated. Happens more often than you'd think." I narrowed my eyes. "Nothing gets reactivated on its own." He raised both hands slightly. "You know how these things work. If a document had pre-authorized renewal language, well, it's not always so black and white." "And if someone helped the gray along?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he adjusted his tie, just as the elevator behind him dinged open. The last person I expected to see stepped out of that elevator, Beaumont Relis. His hair had thinned, but the old cocky grin was untouched. He opened his arms slightly. "Alder, you really do show up when it counts." He walked toward me like we were about to grab a drink. "Been a while," he said. "You left a lot open-ended back then, old friend." I said nothing. Devon's eyes shifted toward me, gauging the weight of my silence. Beaumont continued, as if reading from a script. "Taryn just wants what's best for the legacy. We're helping him structure things cleanly. No messes. No court battles. That's what this is." "You're calling theft a legacy now?" I asked, voice low. He smiled, unbothered. "Perspective is everything." I turned to Devon. "Did you draft any of this?" "Just consulted," he said quickly. "Mostly advising Taryn." The room felt colder than outside. "Funny," I said quietly. "You all talk like this was inevitable. Like I just forgot to keep up." Beaumont stepped closer. "It's better this way. Alder, you're part of the plan, whether you realize it or not. You always were." He paused. "You built the stage. Now it's time to let the next act begin." I looked at him for a long moment, then I replied, "Be careful, Beau. Some stages burn better than others." Outside, the cold felt sharper, wind picking up off the lake. I stomped toward the truck, needing space, air, time, anything that wasn't that building. When I reached the driver's side, I saw it, a bright orange parking ticket fluttering under my wiper blade. I sighed, pulling it free, then flipped it over. Someone had scribbled a note on the back in rushed block letters. "They're already moving. Watch the east storage." No name, no signature, but the handwriting. It wasn't Devon's or Beaumont's. It was someone else. I stared down the block for a long while, then climbed in and turned the key. "I'm not the one being watched anymore," I murmured. The road to Shelburne was lined with trees weighed down by the season's first serious snow. Their bare limbs, streaked with ice, looked like they were reaching for something just out of sight. Maybe that was fitting. I drove slower than usual, the paper note crumpled in my jacket pocket, its words echoing louder than any storm warning on the radio. "Watch the east storage." Not your storage. The east. That choice of words, pointed, deliberate, lingered like a whisper with teeth. I hadn't been back to the unit in years. Rented it right after the divorce, mostly to get old ghosts out of the house. A few keepsakes, personal documents, and that filing cabinet I'd never let anyone touch. The place was meant to be private, untouched, locked not just with a padlock but with history. Pulling into the gravel lot, I saw it immediately, the lock, newer, sleeker, with no scratches around the latch like mine had, wrong kind of brass. I stared at it for a full minute before trying my keys anyway, though I already knew none would fit. They didn't. The third one bent slightly in protest. I stepped inside the office. The manager, young, earbuds in, not more than 25, glanced up like I was interrupting something sacred. "You changed your lock 2 weeks ago, remember?" he said when I asked. "No," I answered flatly. "I remember burying my wife that week." He paled, looked down. "Sorry, that's just what's in the log." 5 minutes later, I stood next to him as he clipped the lock. The bolt snapped with a sharp clack, and the door rolled up like the lid on something better left buried. The inside was colder than I remembered, and wrong, not vandalized, rearranged. The filing cabinet was open, drawers empty, my folders were gone. The envelope marked Grand Isle Land Title, the backup copies of my insurance policies. The old letters I never mailed, they weren't misplaced, they were gone. But someone had left a calling card. On top of the cabinet sat a red envelope, thick paper, one word printed across the front in all caps, "Do not contact." I opened it carefully. Inside was a document, legal, printed, precise. A contract naming me as a trustee in something called Crowley Legacy Financial Trust. The signature was mine, electronically stamped. I hadn't touched a computer in weeks. The scent hit me then. Faint, but specific. That old cologne Taryn used in college. Back when he still borrowed my car. Back when he still hugged me without needing something first. I stepped outside. My breath hung in the air, sharp as my thoughts. I pulled out my phone and called Leora. She answered on the third ring, her voice breathless, like she'd just finished running. "Grandpa?" "Everything okay?" "Quick question," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "You still keep Grandma's estate binder?" "Of course. Hidden in plain sight, like you told me." "Good. Don't let it out of your sight." She paused. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart." But I wasn't. I was calculating. I didn't tell her about the document or the smell or the padlock that wasn't mine. I just stood there in the cold, watching the wind whip up tiny ghosts of dust and salt around my boots. As I turned to leave, I glanced up. The camera above the unit blinked red. Recording, watching, waiting. They knew I'd come. They knew what I'd find. I stared straight at the lens and said, "You're going to need a better plan." I'd barely reached the truck before my phone buzzed again. A text, no number attached, just words. "You were never meant to see that envelope." The morning fog hung low over the hills like an old quilt left out too long, thin, frayed, and damp. I drove northeast with the heater rattling against the cold, gravel popping under the tires of my truck. I hadn't visited the family cabin in 12 years. The last time was when Leora was still in pigtails and Taryn still bothered to call me Dad. Back then, the cabin felt like a sanctuary. Now it felt like a question I didn't want answered. The long dirt road twisted through woods that had lost most of their leaves, their bare limbs like fingers pointing at me. I reached the clearing by mid-morning. There it stood, same green paint, same moss climbing the porch posts. What was different, though, was the door, not the wood, but the locks. 2 of them. One, rusted and dulled, was mine. I remembered buying it the same week I signed the divorce papers. The other one, shiny, new, and drilled in just a few inches off angle, like a signature that tried too hard to look natural. I tried my key on both. Only the old lock yielded. I circled around the back, kicked open the old tool shed, and pulled out the bolt cutters I hadn't touched in over a decade. When I clipped through the new padlock, it fell like dead weight. Whoever installed it had no right to, but they'd been in here, whoever they were. Inside, the cabin still smelled like cedar and thyme. A film of dust settled over everything, undisturbed. But it didn't fool me. Some silences aren't peaceful, they're strategic. I headed to the attic, ducking under low beams until I reached the far corner. Beneath a loose floorboard I pried up with the claw of a hammer. I found the weatherproof box I'd hidden long ago. Still there, but lighter. My heart tapped out a warning beat. I opened it. Inside, the original paper copy of my will, my signature in ink, yellowing edges. No mention of the Crowley Legacy Trust, just my assets. Split cleanly. And then another document, one I'd nearly forgotten about. A notarized amendment dated 10 years ago, naming Leora as contingent beneficiary. It was all untouched and real. Then my phone buzzed. Voicemail. Leora's voice, hushed and quick. "Dad came to my dorm. He was asking about your documents. Acting weird. I told him I was at a study group. I lied. Grandpa, something's wrong. Be careful. She hung up just as her voice cracked. I stared at the rafters above me, feeling both old and sharpened at once. They were circling, not just the will, not just the land, my bloodline, my granddaughter. I walked back downstairs, fighting the urge to punch something. At the desk drawer, I found the old guest logbook. No one was supposed to sign in. It was just a tradition. I flipped to the last few pages, and there it was. 2 entries, both recent, one dated 2 weeks ago. The same week the padlock on my storage unit was changed. The name scribbled on the line, Alder H. It wasn't my hand. It looked like mine. Close enough to fool a clerk or a banker, but not me. They were forging me, not just my signature, my presence. I stood by the door, staring out into the brittle trees, mind racing through every document, every location I once considered safe. This wasn't theft. This was occupation. I didn't lock the door behind me. Instead, I slipped the cut padlock back over the latch and left it hanging, like bait. And just before I stepped off the porch, I used the toe of my boot to scrawl 3 words in the dust. You missed something. I climbed into the truck, took a breath, reached for my keys, and saw it. A folded sticky note, flapping under the windshield wiper. Just 5 words in hurried ink. You're late. My fingers closed around it. The words weren't just a warning. They were a signal. Whoever I was up against wasn't working alone, and they weren't improvising. They were following a plan. So was I. I didn't call ahead. Men like Devin Frayne didn't need appointments from old clients. They needed reminders. His office sat like a well-fed parasite in the heart of Burlington. One of those glass and walnut places meant to intimidate, though it only made me itch. The receptionist looked up, confused. Her nameplate read Blair. Devin must have traded in the last one. This one wore sharper lipstick. She opened her mouth to object, but Devin emerged from his office just in time to see me. Alder? His voice cracked halfway between surprise and calculation. Come in. The last time I stood in this lobby, there was a painting of a schooner on the wall. Now it was some sterile abstract thing, colorless, like Devin's conscience. The filing cabinets were still locked. That hadn't changed. I stepped into his office. He gestured to the chair across from him, but I stayed standing. You remodeled, I said. Looks more like a bank than a lawyer's office now. People like clean lines. Predictability, he replied, folding his hands. What brings you by? I've been thinking about locks lately, I said casually. Particularly the ones on cabins and storage units. Strange how they can change without you knowing. Devin blinked once. I'm not sure I follow. No? I leaned slightly over his desk. Then maybe you'll follow this. Someone forged my name into a guest book at a cabin I haven't touched in a decade. The same week my storage unit got re-secured. I figure you might know who's been making legal moves on my behalf. He kept his face still, but the corner of his lip twitched. There haven't been any filings under your name recently. Alder. I let the silence hang, then said, Let's check anyway. Show me the most recent version of my will you have on file. His hand moved slowly toward the drawer. His fingers grazed the handle, then froze. That was all the answer I needed. Before either of us could say a word, the conference room door behind me clicked open. Footsteps. I turned. Taryn, wearing a tailored gray suit that probably cost more than my truck. Behind him stood a woman with a leather binder and a smile too polished to be real. The man beside her looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days, some paralegal on damage control. Taryn stepped forward like he owned the room. Dad, so glad you made it. I didn't move. This is Camille, he said, gesturing to the mediator. We've scheduled a voluntary mediation session, just to clear the air. I didn't volunteer, Taryn chuckled. Let's be civilized. Dad, you wanted clarity? Well, here it is. I sat. Slowly. Devin didn't meet my eye. Camille started with platitudes about family and compromise. Taryn spoke smoothly about protecting assets, intergenerational harmony, and streamlining legal ambiguities. I listened to every word, nodding like a senile old man. But under my jacket, a voice recorder hummed. I'd turned it on the moment I stepped into the building, and when the stack of legal forms hit the table, labeled Trust Reformation Request, I asked one question, quietly. Which one of you drafted the Crowley Legacy Trust filed last June? Taryn answered before thinking. Devin. Devin's glare cut him short, but it was too late. The mediator blinked. The paralegal looked up. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands, and said, "Thank you for your transparency." Then I stood. Devin rose as well. "Alder, you're not thinking clearly. You need representation. You were my representation," I said, voice flat. "And now you're something else." I walked to the door. No one stopped me, not even Taryn. In the parking lot, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I pulled out my phone and texted Leora, "Get ready. We're going public soon." Then I popped the glove compartment and removed the envelope I'd kept buried there for years. Yellowed edges, labeled in black Sharpie, burn file. Inside were old receipts, notarized papers, and something more valuable than gold, a calling card from a retired probate judge named Elias Rusk, a man who still owed me a favor from '92. As I placed the envelope back down, I caught movement in my rearview mirror. A black sedan, same make and model I'd seen parked in the tree line near the cabin. It pulled out after me. I didn't panic. I didn't even flinch. Let them follow. The game had changed. And now I was done playing fair. The gravel crackled beneath my tires like a voice clearing its throat. Sybil's driveway hadn't changed in decades. Birch trees on either side, their pale bark catching the last light of afternoon like old bones. The house came into view slowly, crouched at the edge of the woods. White paint flaked from the shutters, and the chimney leaned slightly, like it had given up standing straight. She was already at the door when I pulled in. She held a pie dish with a checkered cloth draped over it, like some Norman Rockwell painting stuck in time. "I didn't know if you'd actually come," she said. "I didn't know either," I replied. We stood there for a moment, just long enough for the air to thicken with what we weren't saying. Then she gestured me in. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and something floral, lavender, maybe. Sybil poured tea into mismatched mugs and slid one toward me. We sat in silence for a while, watching steam curl between us like smoke from an old fire. "You remember the harvest party of '87? I asked finally. Her face didn't move, but her fingers tightened on the mug. "You mean when Dad gave you the deed to the East Meadow but filed the trust without telling me?" I nodded. "That's the one." She looked away. "I kept some things. Thought you might come asking one day." I didn't speak. She stood and motioned toward the narrow stairs that led to the attic. "Come on. You want answers? You'll need boots." The attic groaned as we entered, each step stirring up dust and memory. Sybil pushed aside a stack of old quilts and revealed a small fireproof box. On the lid, Dad's Trust, Originals. She handed it to me, her hands shaking just slightly. Inside, 3 documents rested like bones in a drawer. First, a handwritten note from our father, dated just before his last hospitalization. "I'm trusting Alder to carry the burden. Tell Sybil when she's ready. M.H." Second, a quitclaim deed for the East Meadow, signed 2 weeks before he passed. Third, a typed witness list, notarized, bearing a name I hadn't heard in years, Graham Frayne. I stared at the signature, ice settling in my spine. "Devin's father?" I asked. Sybil nodded. "Dad trusted him." I didn't. Twist S14 landed like a thunderclap. Devin had grown up watching his father manipulate estate papers. The fraud I faced wasn't born in a vacuum. It was inherited, just like the land. "He trained his son well," I muttered. Sybil sat down on a crate, looking smaller than I remembered. I suspected something was wrong for years, but by the time I had the courage to ask, you were gone, and I didn't want to tear the family apart. "This family was already torn," I said, voice low. "We just swept the pieces under rugs like this one." She looked up, eyes brimming. "If it comes to court, if you need me, I'll testify." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "Thank you. That means more than you know." As I walked back down the path, the sun had dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across the gravel. I unlocked my truck and slipped behind the wheel. Just as I turned the ignition, my phone buzzed. Leora. I answered immediately. "Grandpa?" she whispered, panicked. "Someone came to the house asking questions about you." My blood ran cold. What did they look like? A man, gray suit, said he was with Internal Asset Review. No name tag, had a badge, but it didn't look right. Did you let him in? No, I lied. Told him you were in rehab upstate. Smart girl. Stay alert, I said, and keep the binder locked. Okay. But Grandpa, why are they after you? I didn't answer. I hung up slowly and stared through the windshield at the darkening trees. They're not just after the will, I murmured. They're after what's buried. The rain tapped on the window like a metronome, keeping time I never asked for. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, the one with the lumpy mattress and peeling headboard, and stared at the brass key I'd pulled from the lining of my old checkbook folder. It had been tucked behind a safe deposit record for years. I almost forgot it existed, until Sybil's words came back. He left you something only you could open. I turned the key over in my hand. It had no tag, no label. But the weight of it, that weight hadn't changed in 30 years. The highway to Berlin, Vermont, was empty, blanketed in a light drizzle and lined with trees, trading green for gold. I drove without music, only the hum of the engine and the occasional creak from the glove box, where that envelope still sat. I passed the old sawmill my father once took me to. I was 9. He handed me a rusted wrench and said, "Some things we bury to protect, not to hide. If you ever need to dig, make sure it's for the right reasons." Back then, I thought he meant tools. Now, I knew better. Locker number 218 sat at the far end of the row, half swallowed by weeds and years of neglect. The manager hadn't asked questions. I paid in cash. The key slid into the lock like it had never left. The air inside was thick with dust and time. There was only one object of note, a military-style lockbox bolted to the floor. Next to it, a stack of vinyl folders, aged and curling at the corners. On top, a single manila envelope. My hands didn't shake, but my breath caught when I opened it. Inside was a second, pristine copy of my father's original will, dated, notarized, signed. But this one had an addendum I'd never seen, a paragraph at the bottom, typed in bold. In the event Alder Huxley is ever removed from this estate without cause or due process, this directive shall override subsequent filings. He is not merely heir, but steward, my executor, until his own death. A signature, my father's. Below that, another folded sheet, a notarized letter. If you're reading this, Alder, something has gone wrong. And finally, a faded Polaroid. Me holding Taryn as a baby. On the back, legacy isn't money, it's memory. Dad. I didn't realize I was crying until the ink began to blur. I stepped outside into the damp air and pulled out my phone. Devin answered on the third ring. "Frayne," he said, too calm. "What do you know about Internal Asset Review?" I asked. Silence. "They visited my granddaughter," he sighed. "They're private, not official. They work, loosely, with firms that handle legacy protections. Your father's firm," I said flatly. More silence. "I didn't know they were still active," Devin finally muttered. "They were supposed to be dissolved years ago." I told him about the documents. He didn't ask for copies. Instead, he said, "Don't scan them. Don't email. Meet me tomorrow. In person." "Why?" I asked. "That letter from your father, it might hold more than you think." Then he hung up. I placed the folders back in the lockbox and resealed it. The envelope went into my jacket. The key. I slipped onto a chain around my neck, close to the skin. Something about the cold metal grounded me. I stood there a moment longer, taking one last look at the locker. "This isn't over," I whispered. "But now, I've got leverage." As I pulled the door shut and clicked it locked, a noise caught my attention. Tires on gravel. A black sedan eased into the lot and parked 2 rows over. Tinted windows. No license plate in front. I didn't wait. I slid into the truck, started the engine, and pulled out. My eyes never left the rearview mirror. I sat on the porch for a while before calling her. The brass key still hung around my neck, cool against my skin, as if my father's legacy had a pulse. I stared at the phone in my hand, thumb hovering above her name. It rang twice. "Grandpa?" Leora's voice was tight, guarded. "I'm not calling about your father," I said softly. "I'm calling for you." A long pause. I have something you deserve to see. No pressure. Just you and me." She didn't say yes. But she didn't hang up either. Devin looked like he hadn't slept since the Nixon administration. His tie was askew, shirt half untucked, and the scent of stale coffee clung to the office like regret. He glanced at the envelope and documents I laid before him like they were ticking. "You're certain this came from your father?" he asked, carefully peeling back the flap of the notarized letter. "I was there when he signed my will. I'd know his damn penmanship anywhere." Devin read silently, lips tightening. "Your father didn't just make you heir," he murmured. "He embedded a clause, unusual, but brilliantly veiled. It was intended to trigger a legal freeze if a grandchild acted in defense of the estate." I raised an eyebrow. "It's vague on purpose," Devin continued, "but it has teeth. If an executor shows signs of acting with selfish intent, any under 25 named blood relative can file a motion to pause distribution pending a secondary review." "You mean Leora?" "She's the only one who qualifies, and she'll need to do it knowingly." That last word lodged somewhere behind my ribs. Leora arrived 20 minutes later, backpack slung over one shoulder, hair tied in a loose knot like she'd left class mid-thought. She looked at the documents on Devin's desk but didn't approach. "I didn't come to play messenger," she said. I stood slowly, gesturing to the seat beside me. "You don't have to deliver anything," I replied. "But you deserve to know what kind of legacy you're from." She sat, reluctantly. Devin explained the clause in plain terms. The paperwork, the purpose, her unique role. Leora's brow furrowed. "What if I don't want to fight him? He's still my dad." "You don't have to fight," I said gently. "You just have to hold the truth." Her hands fidgeted, then stilled. I remembered those same hands pulling dandelions from our backyard when she was 6. She had cried when I mowed them. "This doesn't erase anything," she whispered. "No," I agreed. "But it might stop what comes next." She nodded. Just once. Devin drafted the activation filing while Leora sat motionless. When he slid the paper across the table, she signed without flair. No speech, no glance for approval, just ink and resolve. Devin uploaded the filing to the internal court processing system, a silent move that would trigger a legal pause under probate law. No press, no drama, but irreversible. Leora stood, pulling her backpack onto her shoulder. "He won't forgive me," she said. I met her eyes. "Neither of us needs his forgiveness anymore." She left before I could say anything else. I stayed after she was gone. Devin cleared his throat, but said nothing. I drifted toward the window, watching shadows stretch across the sidewalk below. For a brief moment, I could see Leora as a child, spinning in circles under the apple tree behind my house, laughing in a world untouched by legacy or greed. Devin broke the silence. "This changes everything." "Not everything," I said. "Just enough." The room fell quiet again, thick with memory, but lighter somehow. Then Devin's phone buzzed on the desk. He read the screen, face tightening like a man watching the first crack in a dam. "Taryn's lawyers just filed a response," he said. "An aggressive one." The sound of a car door closing woke me before the sun had fully claimed the sky. I sat up, the ache in my joints dull and familiar, and noticed an envelope poking in under the front door. Someone had slid it through the gap. Careful, deliberate. I moved slowly, every instinct alert. The envelope bore my name in familiar curves. Too familiar. My late wife's handwriting. I opened it with stiff fingers. The ink was the same soft blue she always used. The signature was hers, or something pretending to be. The message read, "In the event of conflicting instructions, I hereby clarify that my original intent was for our son, Taryn, to manage the estate in full. Sentiment cannot override legacy. I sat down, the letter trembling in my hands. My wife had written a directive before she died, one we'd notarized together. This wasn't it. This one reeked of mimicry and something darker, calculated doubt. Devon's office was quiet when I arrived 20 minutes later, the envelope tucked inside my coat. "Again?" he said, raising an eyebrow. I handed him the letter without a word. He slipped on his reading glasses, read silently, then exhaled slowly. "Postmarked 2 days ago," he muttered, "from a mailbox not far from Taryn's condo." He pulled open a drawer and retrieved the original letter from my wife. Placing them side by side, he studied the strokes like a surgeon reading a scar. "This one's not notarized," he said, tapping the new letter. "Convenient, isn't it?" I didn't respond. I just stared at the name signed at the bottom. Devon called in a favor. An old friend, retired forensic analyst, stopped by within the hour. He brought a portable magnifier, a tablet, and the tired, skeptical look of someone who's seen too much human greed. He examined both letters, side by side, stroke by stroke. After 20 minutes, he looked up and said, "The first letter, real, fluid motion, no tremor. The second, someone traced her hand, microscopic lift and set patterns, probably used a light box." Devon swore under his breath. "This isn't just messy, it's malicious." I said nothing, but something inside me was coiling tighter and tighter, like piano wire stretched past reason. "He wants to break the credibility of every document we have," I said quietly. "Create noise so no one knows what to trust. Not even me." Devon nodded. "He's building a smokescreen." We prepared the packet. Both letters, dates, postmarks, original notarization, Lyora's clause, the witness list, the key timeline. Devon warned me mid-drafting. "There's more coming. Taryn's lawyer filed a motion accusing you of coercing Lyora. They're laying a trap." "Good," I replied. "Let them. I want this in front of a judge." Devon stopped writing. "You're sure?" I looked him in the eye. "I've spent 20 years hoping my son would remember who raised him. Now I want the court to remember who I am." We printed the documents. Devon submitted them to the probate clerk's portal. We weren't just responding, we were stepping into the fire. As I left Devon's office, I pulled the second letter out once more, rereading it slowly. One line stabbed harder than the rest. The inheritance should follow tradition, not sentiment. No, that wasn't her. That was him. My wife loved sentiment. She kept every macaroni necklace Lyora ever made, every letter I ever wrote her from the road. She would never have written that. "That's not her voice," I muttered. "That's his." I tucked the letter back into the folder and stepped out into the afternoon wind, anger burning low in my gut, not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that waits for the right moment to strike with precision. Devon's phone buzzed just as I reached my car. He opened the message, read it, then looked at me across the lot. "Taryn's filed for an emergency injunction," he said. The war was no longer brewing. It had begun. The courtroom was colder than it looked. I sat with my hands folded, watching Taryn's attorneys speak like men who believed the sound of their voice could bend reality. I didn't flinch. I'd heard more lies in this room than I ever did raising that boy. Devon stood when called. His voice was firm but measured, laying out the timeline, the forensic analysis, the discrepancies between the original letter and the forgery Taryn tried to sneak in. And then came Lyora's sworn statement, clear, brave, and devastatingly final. The judge read silently for what felt like years, then spoke plainly. "The original will stands. The fraudulent materials presented will be submitted for further review." A gavel strike later, and it was over. Taryn stood up and shouted, "This isn't over," before two officers guided him out, like a man who had just realized the chessboard was never his to command. I didn't gloat. I just watched. I declined the cameras, the microphones, the questions. Instead, I walked out through the back exit, down a side street, and into the park behind the courthouse. I gave my life away piece by piece, I said under my breath. For them. The trees were still green. Children played in the distance. My hands trembled, not from age, but from release. The kind you feel when a weight you've carried for years finally rolls off your back and hits the dirt with a thud. Sacrifice never made me bitter, but it did make me quiet. And now, for the first time in a long while, I felt no need to explain myself. A week later, I set the table for 3. Just Sybil, Leora, and me. No speeches, no toasts. Just plates, forks, and 1 bottle of Sybil's homemade raspberry wine that had too much bite and too little sugar, just the way our mother used to make it. Leora arrived holding a small box wrapped in brown paper and twine. "She would have wanted you to have this," she said softly. Inside was a silver locket. I opened it slowly. One side held a picture of Leora as a baby. The other, a younger me, holding her on the porch swing I built with my own hands. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. We were halfway through Sybil's pie when Leora set her fork down. "I always knew what they were after," she said. "That's why I recorded everything." I looked up. The emails, the drafts of that forged letter, the phone calls. I never trusted Dad or Devon entirely, so I kept copies. I gave them to Devon before the mediation. I leaned back, blinking slowly. "You were the plan all along," I said. She smiled. Someone had to break the pattern. Sybil dabbed her eyes with a napkin and whispered, "She did." I nodded. I'd prepared strategies, I'd traced signatures, but I hadn't seen this coming. Not her strength, not her foresight. The war had been won before I ever stepped into court, because she'd already taken the first shot. The next morning, I was in the garden, pruning the roses with shears older than Taryn's career. "It wasn't about the money," I murmured. "It was about being remembered right." From the porch, Leora called out, "You ready for breakfast, Grandpa?" I turned, sunlight catching the locket around my neck. "Yeah, let's eat." Sometimes it's not about revenge. It's about making sure the right people have the light to walk forward. I've lived my story. Now it's hers to write.